All right, look it. I hope you will not be excessively insulted that I consider you to be my colleagues in this inquiry. It is an old investigation, this delicious puzzle of how love and mechanism operate together over the endless history of changing forms. Contemplative minds in 19th century Europe and America treated this as a wrestling match between Christian altruism and Darwinian selfishness. Yet the basic outlines of these arguments can be found in the fragmentary writings of early Greek sages and perhaps in the haunting glyphs of even earlier civilization. We stand before this question together now as they did, and if your ardent wish is to quickly make up your mind about whether or not Eros is a real player in evolution, you will doubtless be confused and disappointed by my confessional testimony today. I am not intending to take sides on this issue, but rather to enter with greater precision into the exquisite hinterland between the positions. Let me begin by saying that I embrace a particular version of the integral four quadrants and four states as a description of my experience of reality, and therefore also of my assumptions about the type of universe in which evolution occurs. This is a multidimensional situation. However, that does not mean it needs to be a metaphysical or traditionally religious situation. I will propose some notions of Eros that may be applicable in reality as I understand it, but I will nevertheless oppose the phraseology that concretizes the poetic metaphor of Eros into a pseudo-scientific fact, as if that were the necessary solution to some yawning explanatory gap in the natural sciences. I will also oppose any infinite or unthinkable force imagined to enter the whole system from the non-existent outside in order to drive changes in a particular direction that it desires. Darwin. Darwinism is dangerous, not because it can be used blithely by ethnocentric social engineers and capitalist predators to justify what they would be doing already anyway, but rather because we often assume we know what Darwinism means when we really don't. And that's especially true today. The popular idea of Darwinism, bugaboo of many resurgent monotheists and intelligent designers, is a feeble and misleading understanding of a beautiful insight. This false impression is due in no small part to the unpleasant demeanor of many popularizers who wish to present themselves vainly as realists and also to present their own grievances under the protective aegis of hard-nosed realism. Many self-proclaimed Darwinists are enough to make anyone flirt with intelligent design. But today's actual neo-Darwinism works hand in hand with neo-Lamarckian epigenetics, symbiotic evolution, and the understanding that DNA provides a toolkit of flexible and combinatorial routines that can be used in widely different types of bodies or phenotypes without needing to be uniquely evolved on the spot. All of that is well accepted. And legitimate debate continues about where and how well these Darwinian evolutionary insights can be generalized and applied in other areas. Does the evolutionary process, which works primarily with integrated viral clusters or genes as replicators, get mirrored in the unfolding dynamics of bodies, groups, or cultural ideas? Yes and no is the main answer from all leading biological scientists. They're working on it. Nonetheless, it would be difficult to find a model that is more proven, useful, and productive than the Darwinian theory. It says simply and gracefully that nature has the built-in ability to carve itself rather quickly into distinct and intelligently adapted forms of life without a plan or overview, merely by experimenting and reproducing where there is adequate environmental feedback. Organisms whose functional gene-derived shapes are better adapted to their personal relationships and ecological niches are obviously more likely to survive long enough to reproduce fertile offspring before death. Thus, these genes are more likely to get copied into the future. This is an art great enough to produce virtually all the magnificently intelligent and glorious patterns we find in the record of terrestrial biospheres. And although it is predicated upon a mechanism of survival, this survival of the fittest is fundamentally a struggle with yourself to fit into your real circumstances, and only secondarily and often infrequently a fight to outdo other members of your species or nearby rivals. Now, personally, I find myself, like Friedrich Nietzsche, very interested in the notion of a general subjective correlate to all physical energy. He called it will to power or self-overcoming, and he was careful to distinguish this as if proto-intentionality from his mentor Schopenhauer's concept of a basic will to live or a will to survive. Trying to perpetuate yourself is not an adequate description of what everything always does. However, even if we began evolution with a more generalized idea of an underlying intent that is quite indifferent to survival, we would find that eventually only the surviving forms of beings would carry their versions of that intent onward. Thus, given time, the vast majority of pathways engaged by the will to power would be those that do so with a survival orientation. Now, Darwinism selects from among changes, but does not care whence the changes come. It does not, in fact, insist that they are random mutations, but rather that it makes no difference whether they are or not. They might as well be random. If you discovered proof that ancient aliens spliced our DNA, or that some remarkable interior process exerts intention upon gene mutation, these influences would stand before the Darwinian gate of reproduction exactly as if they were a product of pure chance. That's what makes it so effective and beautiful. Now, if we wish to articulate all of this mythopoetically, and I view myth as a psychologically important thing for human beings, we would require both an eros, the improvisational production of new hopes, and a thanatos, an appropriate culling, selection, and discrimination. Cancer and suicide would be examples of either force, eros or thanatos, operating excessively on its own without sufficient integration with its reciprocal. However, to call these forces is to impute a kind of false physics, one that does not help much with the study of actual physics, nor even with the evocative power of myth. You may get a short-term boost in mythic efficacy by asserting poetry as fact, but over time, this both disturbs the growth of knowledge and shuts down the processes by which our subconscious instincts select for nourishing mythic impressions. Although Darwinism does not require chance per se, it is nonetheless closely aligned with the principle of unpredictable complex patterning. The observations of computational complexity sciences suggest that seemingly random processes are not non-deterministic, but simply complex enough that no other complex system, such as ourselves, can directly predict them. And this has a bearing on the following question: can chance give rise to order? It's actually a bad question. Or rather, it's a good question, but only for counterbalancing the equally bad dogmatic idea that insists that any observed contemporary order must have its source in an original orderly phenomenon, such as a creator God. That is a purely metaphysical notion, which is usefully recontextualized when we understand it as literally just as reasonable to assume that order evolves naturally from chaos by blind mechanisms. They hold each other in check, but neither of these ideas are quite correct. They involve outdated populist notions about the difference between determinism and randomness. We see in our existing world two kinds of production of order or intelligent design. The first kind is simply an extension from previous organization. A painter gives rise to a painting, a parent gives rise to a child. However, when we look closely, we get into a non-explanatory infinite regress where we end up having to ask where the first organization came from. And only chaos presents itself as something from which first order could emerge. On the other hand, the second kind of production of order we see today is when it emerges naturally from disorder under certain special thermodynamic conditions. Yet this is not purely random. The special conditions are very precise, and we also know that apparently disorderly patterns may be entirely predictable at speeds that simply exceed what the computations of human brains can accomplish. So philosophically, we end up facing the fact that even if all order originally comes from disorder, this disorder has to be already organized enough to have accomplished that task. It must exhibit a minimum property of order already in order to operate coherently as disorder. Even to distinguish it from order requires that it be in some sense precise and self-consistent, something organized in distinction to something else. A small requirement, but an important one. We cannot quite roll our thinking back to a point of original order or disorder. our only option of thought turns out to be a minimally interlinked quasi-threshold of disorder. Philosophical reasoning like this about the preconditions of our experience is not common to evolutionary biological scientists, and need not be. However, such explorations are necessary for the evocation of integrative, interdisciplinary meta-models. In that kind of work, we find that certain ontological principles are required in order for a cosmos to function. The physical universe, for example, has certain patterns and mathematical physical constraints without which it could not operate nor come into being. Such preliminary and primary parameters in physics rest in turn upon certain basic syntactical assumptions inherently presupposed by all models and all observations. A minimal set of prerequisites for real processes to occur. This is implicit in all the sciences, but generally of explicit interest only to mystics, mathematicians, logicians, and philosophers. And since I fall into some of these categories, I shall have to make a quick personal statement. Nexus. In my own contemplative experience, I apparently cannot avoid the sense of a nexus, or perhaps an underlying root to this interoperable web of implicit syntax that makes physics and thought possible. Perhaps this nexus even reiterates itself temporarily at certain sites in the history of the real cosmos, where a kind of balance between the pull upon pulls of basic parameters of the universe dovetail together into something like a mandalic set of unforced teleological aesthetics. That's a speculative extension of the underlying logic I'm reporting. Wink. Now, it looks to me like this nexus in its most basic form is a functional prerequisite for the self-processing informational proto-structure of any kind of energetic reality. And sentences like that, of course, are simultaneously wild, but also very sober statements. It is quite plausible that the network of proto-computational patterns, whose mutual constraints make the interactive processes of any materialistic energetic universe possible, have a variably holographic or distributed epicenter such that it provides simultaneous convergence and divergence for the informational state of the whole system in each moment. Now, sentences like that are unlikely to please either the scientist or the mystic, but I'm not convinced that is entirely my fault. Most models of quantum mechanics, excepting the many worlds model, feature informational non-locality and instantaneous or virtually instantaneous updated information distribution. In such a universe, I do not think it is extraordinary to suppose that a convergence of the combined momenta of all the local unfolding patterns has some centralized but distributed means of outputting updated system refreshed data. This nexus would necessarily then seem to be both implicit and outside of the system configuration, as well as seeming to be totally informed, radiant, and ultra-coordinated. I'm not asserting this God as a fact. I'm merely reporting a repeated observation of mine that I feel need not be in conflict with the universe of the natural sciences. Any good integrative meta-theory must be prepared to have good relations with the shifting conclusions of the sciences. A good integrative idea, for example, should work well with our current 13.5 billion year estimate about the Big Bang, but also validate itself independently of either that specific time frame or the general theoretical notion of a creation singularity. Either conclusion could turn out at some point to be a fictitious artifact of 20th century physics. Thus, in my own reasoning, I imagine a distant primitive circumstance, unknown, at which I provisionally think of the current regime of cosmic changes starting to evolve forward. From this archaic point, we find the universe unfolding in a very straightforward and chance-like manner that progressively adapts to the production and securing of local habits of organization, with incremental changes in what Eric Chasson would call improved maximal energy rate density among structures. Over the eons, many features become regular and act as the launching ground for further emergent processes of additional production and destruction. Within this whole arena of constant reinforcing, transmuting, or destructive changes, there are certain special moments at which, to us, there appear to be a significant shift, and also then a history of these apparently significant shifts. We think of them as the emergence of wholes that enfold but perpetuate prior wholes. Thus, holarchic chains began to unfold and be distinguishable over time, stacked on top of each other, and these local successes might be described by special constraints upon the general horizontal process of improvisational adaptation and selection that we call evolution, which is in general a process that frequently fails or accomplishes nothing progressive and whose successes are merely those of relational adaptation. Holarchic emergence is much more particular than that. The history of holons is a subset of general evolutionary change, characterized by being relatively rare, progressive in complexity and subjective significance, and increasingly able to freely repattern environments. If I can believe my inner vision, then the information syntactic nexus of prerequisites of physical laws plays a peculiar role in these holonic chains. That site of informational consilience, whereupon a certain harmony of forces is super coordinated and fed back as the updated and coherent data about the current general system state, presents itself as the junction or docking point where every next unfolding holon structurally engages the current holon. This nexus looks to me as though it is distributed to and as holons, but not as heaps. It is not equally ubiquitous in all space and time, but is characterized by a variable probability topology. Now, assuming, wildly perhaps, that this is the case, that ontology has a probabilistic slant in the direction of this nexus, is that necessarily, therefore, significant for the natural sciences? No, not very much. Natural sciences should try to explain as much as possible with their existing assumptions. Parsimony is the virtue of systems. And if there is an attraction or slope exerted by this nexus, then it should be conceived of as vanishingly small. This is quite appropriate for the infinitesimal and endlessly removed status of the self-processing informational proto-sequence and syntax in which that distributed nexus may be based. Such an influence in the cosmos would play a role only when all other things are equal. That means that a small skewing operates only when no other more prominent skewings are in the way. Einstein taught us that gravity is not a force, but rather a universally distributed field of geometrical slant that can act like a force and provide energy in any local circumstance. We humans are slanted currently toward the Earth below, but if that vanished or was counterbalanced effectively, we would become more subject to the ever-present but minimal slanting toward the Sun. Notably, however, in the history of life on Earth, there are no prominent or regular instances of physical organisms being pulled off toward the Sun. Such an influence should therefore be considered to be as minor and infrequent as it is pervasive and consistent. Its general irrelevance to local history accompanies the equally true idea that given enough time, it would win out. So I'm proposing that the slow drift of a special subset of evolving forms mutating into progressive but temporary holarchies can be associated with a kind of probability skewing in favor of greater convergence and integration. However, I expect this to be minimal and to play little or no significant explanatory role in the natural sciences in the immediate future. We might want to call this Eros if we think of it as a striving. We might want to call it agape if we think of it as gravitation. But either way, to keep our post-metaphysical minds clear, we should not think of it as a deliberate agency entering history from the outside and driving the system forward to overcome unthinkable gaps in the progress of science. However, it is very understandable that the notion of an evolutionary drive stands out in more coherent, intricate, and integrated brains. The more you personally experience yourself as a great number of holarchic unfoldings, the more the process of this particular kind of emergence is likely to become salient within your self-sensation. And as your powers of coherent thought, sensitivity, and abstraction increase, it is progressively more likely that you will represent clearly to yourself the processes of ongoing change or evolution and novel accumulation or evolution. Your higher level thinking becomes more and more capable of eliciting and feeling into a common polarization from within all your biopsychological drives and desires. And those who have more sensitive nervous systems will also be inclined to treat their amplified experience of inner flows of excitement, pervading all of their neurocognitive mapping functions, as a primal feature of reality, especially insofar as primal features of reality must to some degree be implicit in everything, including that inner experience of stimulation. Therefore, it is easy for more complex and integrated beings, more simplex beings, to conceive a common destiny for all urges and to feel a powerful overtone shared by all their yearnings, which maps roughly onto their narrative image of the holonically successful subset of evolutionary history. And while I feel all of this very strongly and associate it with my notion of this nexus that I have described, I remain insistent that we be very cautious about asserting this as the mythic fact and essential nature of cosmic, biological, and future history. Now, there's one other form of potential eros that should be considered here, and that's bioenergy. It is fairly well documented that life energy is a useful metaphor which assists in basic physical health practices, ecological attunement, and our access to flow states. However, it remains possible that some life-friendly subtle energy above and beyond mere bioelectromagnetism could be verified with experiments and algebraic methods not currently in vogue. Perhaps it could even prove to be psionically responsible to particular types of subjective intention. This seems self-evidently true to many people, but rather extraordinary proof would be required for it to enter into the ledger of fact. Nevertheless, it remains an open possibility for the natural sciences. Adequately clear hypotheses and explanatory models would have to couple with quantitative experimental observations in order to even begin such a procedure of investigation. And I encourage such things to begin and proceed sensibly. This can all be part of the natural unfoldment of the scientific method to prove, disprove, surprise, or confirm our ideas. Yet it is quite possible that even in the conditions of such a confirmation of an instinctively affirmed but objectively ambiguous life energy, it might play little or no significant explanatory role in evolutionary mechanics. One cannot say for sure, but it would not shock me if 99.9% of evolutionary changes remained adequately explained without such an uncertain power, even were it somehow proven. We must try to remain balanced and open about all possibilities and not treat our description of the objective universe as a battleground upon which our highest values of being depend. I've tried to present my sense here of the sciences alongside my philosophical speculations and my personal mystical observations in a more or less coherent vision using the post-metaphysical standpoint of affirmative skepticism. It seems to me there are several plausible but unproven ways in which Eros makes sense in the process of evolution, but that none of this, real or not, has much significance for the current progress of the natural sciences, particularly those of biological evolution. I hope that our metavision can hold space for the natural sciences on their own terms, non-metaphysically, without necessarily sacrificing certain classically spiritual patterns that occur inside us with great vividness and with a power of supra-meaningful conversion, because I think that's what's going on in my own case.